down after labelling some opponents of gender reforms as bigoted. She also claims that her government has nothing to apologise for amid growing controversy surrounding the housing of transgender prisoners. Now, despite Nicola Sturgeon's comments, which were made during an interview yesterday, she said that trans prisoners will be treated differently. Now, some felt that exposed a fundamental incoherence in her position on the subject. It was something that was exposed via a very polite but extremely persistent questioner. Just have a look at this.
My question is, are all trans women women?
That's not the point that we're dealing with
That's
here.
the question I'm asking.
Trans women are women, but in the prison context, there is no automatic right for a trans woman.
So there are contexts where a trans woman is not a woman?
No, there is... there is circumstances in which a trans woman will be housed in the male prison estate.
Is there any context in which a woman born as a woman will be housed in the male estate?
Look, we're talking here about trans women.
And I'm now asking about women born as women.
I don't think there are circumstances there, but...
So it's different for trans women?
Well, yes, and I'm not...
So they're not equal?
That is not... There is a risk assessment process done for trans women that takes account of the nature of the crime.
So a trans woman is a woman, but not a woman if she has to go to jail for a sex offence.
So ITV News Scotland correspondent Peter Smith was the reporter putting those very, very persistent questions. And Peter, it's such a sensitive issue, but you pursued with this what is to many people the absolutely vital line. And I think it would interest trans women as well as everybody, everybody, which is, at what point does Nicola Sturgeon stop considering trans women women? And it seems to be, as she answered to you, as Richard just said, the point at which they're convicted of a crime and imprisoned. What did you make of what she said?
I think that this exposes that Nicola Sturgeon has got herself in a tangle about this. And it is important, Susanna, that you'd said that this is of interest to both sides of this debate, because while untangling the argument and seeing Nicola Sturgeon wrong-footed or flustered over an issue which she really should have been very confident on, because these are the fundamental questions of the trans debate, not an area that's unfamiliar to her. It's an issue which she has staked her reputation and her career on, now in a constitutional clash with Westminster over her right to make it easier and faster for people in Scotland to legally change gender. So she should be very aware of these issues. And yes, it has been of great interest to people who are opposed to that change in legislation, saying this exposes how poorly thought out the legislation is and how unfamiliar she is with the issue. But I think it's important to say as well that before we do these reports, we have to educate ourselves as journalists. And I'd spoken to trans friends, trans activists, understanding their concerns about changes to the prison policy. And they were saying, well, is Nicola Sturgeon still a trans ally? She has, again, staked her reputation on it. She stood side by side with us. But when there was public pressure, immense public pressure, following the very public scandal of two horrific criminals, a double rapist who had raped as a man while, after being convicted, had transitioned to a woman and now wants to be moved to a women's prison, Isla Bryson, and then days later, Tiffany Scott, who had stalked a teenage girl and then assaulted a nurse, assaulted a female prison officer, again, after these events, decided to transition, now wants to self-identify as a woman, be moved to a women's prison. Two high-profile public events created immense pressure on Nicola Sturgeon, and these trans people were saying, has she buckled under pressure? Is she now, as you said, is she putting caveats on the trans mantra that all women are women? Well, in Nicola Sturgeon's eyes, if you'd asked her that question 2 weeks ago, I don't think she would have been so easily flustered.
You were there. We saw it as a piece of television in 2D, in two dimensions. You were there in reality, in 3D. What was your reading as a journalist of her, well, what came across as incoherence in the face of those very straightforward questions? How do you think she was feeling as you were asking her those questions?
I think that there was a realisation in her eyes and in her manner that this is an extremely complicated and emotive subject, which maybe seems obvious, but that's actually something that Scotland's First Minister has until now played down on her attempts to push through the gender reforms in Scotland, as I say, making it easier and faster for people to change gender, lowering the legal age from 18 to 16. She has been questioned about potential controversies and played down the likelihood. And then it's often the case when the theory meets reality, does it stand up to scrutiny? And I guess when you can see Nicola Sturgeon, who's not an unintelligent person, a supremely intelligent person, a very composed leader, very coherent in interviews normally, when you can see her starting to fluster over, I say, what is actually not a kind of niche part of the debate, but a fundamental part of it. I think that's a moment where Nicola Sturgeon is realising that this is a really complicated issue for her. It's politically sensitive, and that perhaps, despite her saying that she doesn't need to pause and give more consideration to how legislation is drafted, maybe there is cause for her to take a moment of pause and take a breath and rethink how wording is of the legislation, how the legislation is worded going forward, because potentially this is going to open her up to all kinds of problems in the future.
It was a masterclass in very direct questioning. It really was. When the encounter was over, did she look a bit shaken up? Because she looked a bit shaken up to me watching that.
Look, in absolute fairness to Nicola Sturgeon, she's not someone who hides from interviews and tough questions. I mean, True. We know well on this programme that there are previous Prime Ministers who have literally hid from your journalists asking tough questions. Fridges, yeah. Now, Nicola Sturgeon, through the years, has faced tough questions, and she will stand in front of the cameras and face this scrutiny. And again, yesterday was no different. But yes, afterwards, I think there was a moment where I saw that that perhaps there was a little bit of
that didn't go well.
Doubt in her eyes, yes. But it's so important to say she's staked her reputation on this issue. And it's a controversial issue, and many people would say, well, fair play to you, First Minister, you're standing by a minority group and putting your whole weight of your reputation behind this. But then when you see her responses to the question, I think a lot of people are saying, do you really believe what you're saying, or do you still really believe what you're saying?
Peter, thank you very much indeed for your time. As I say, it was a masterclass, actually, in straight news interviewing. OK, we're joined now by the Mail's Andrew Pearce and
I just want to ask, I mean, basically what Nicola Sturgeon said was there are circumstances in which we will not treat trans women as women.
Yeah.
And a lot of women's rights activists who face being called transphobic would say, but that's exactly what we've been saying. And this shouldn't just apply to female-only spaces in prison. This should apply to other female-only
It's what people like J.K. Rowling have been saying all along. She also said in that interview that there were tests in place when it came to trans women involved in crime. Well, those tests failed because there's no way that man who committed 2 rapes and identified as a woman afterwards should have been allowed in a woman-only prison. They've admitted that because they've moved him, because he's still a man, out of the prison. She's got herself into the biggest mess of her reign. She's been leader for 8 years now. I was saying to Kevin, she's reminding me, I adored Margaret Thatcher, but at the end of her 11 years in power, she was often on the defensive, and that's what that reminded me of, a leader who's got her back against the wall.
Kevin, some people wonder if this is Nicola Sturgeon's poll tax.
Yeah.
It may well be, because she's pushed through reforms in Scotland that don't seem to be popular with the people of Scotland. And
they're hugely unpopular, Kevin.
You can change your gender now, which is, and about 30 people in Scotland do a year, which is making it simpler, making you can do it quicker, and you don't need a medical intervention. But it brings to the fore there's competing rights here. Now, trans people are very marginalised, suffer a lot of bigotry and prejudice. But then there is the whole question of women's rights too, and particularly on an area like, I would say, sport, where personally I think you can change your gender, you can't change your sex, you should play in the area of your birth sex. Then you have all these questions going on, because I don't want to mansplain it, and I feel I'm doing it now when I'm chatting with you, but there are all those areas of women's spaces, whether it's refuges, changing rooms, or in prisons. And I think what she needs to say, because watching the case of the double rapist who raped 2 women as a man. The only way he raped them, he could have raped them as a man. Now he says he's transitioning is a trans woman. The truth is, I look at that case and I think, is he really a trans woman, or is he gaming the system?
Which is why trans women look at that case and say...
we don't want anything to do with that person.
Or they might well think that.
It gives trans women a bad name. But the other thing here is, how dare Nicola Sturgeon criticise people who are concerned about this legislation that she's pushed through Scotland? How dare she call people like me are bigots.
She said
and are
some.
homophobes.
They say some. But some are.
But most
some are.
people in Scotland are decent, hard-working people.
Yeah.
They just appall to think
Yeah.
16-year-olds can
If she
change
had
their...
to do that interview,
bigotry.
if she had to do that interview again today, I'm struggling to think how she could have answered, how she'd answer those
I
questions.
don't
any
think she could have done it any other way. And the other thing is, Richard, there was an opportunity for the Scottish Government not to do this because the Tories tabled an amendment in the Scottish Parliament to exclude prisoners, which would stop trans women, male who've committed crimes like rape, going into a women's prison, and the SNP and Labour rejected it.
Yeah, that's violent offenders, particularly offences against women, because there are, in England and Wales, the system is somewhat different on prisons, and you need the Justice Secretary's authority to do that, but there are trans women in women's prisons. You know, people who are born as their sex was men, now women. So there are cases here as well, but it's one of the I think it's the area in politics which can get the very nastiest and real screaming on. But
by calling people bigots,
but there are
homophobes.
Yeah, but there are other people who are bigots on this issue, and they hide sometimes behind difficult cases.
But there are also legitimate questions to be asked about this. And if you say trans women are women until they are convicted of a crime, and then they're not eligible for a place in a women's prison.
Contradiction in terms.
There is
contradiction.
Exactly right.
But look,
Because what are the circumstances of trans women, not women? And both women and trans women will be asking that question.
And you don't want to say, or in any way imply, people who say they are trans women somehow, no, you're not.
That's right.
You're a predator. Yeah. But the law has to cope with people who may be predators.
And it's not bigoted of Rishi Sunak, the government in Westminster, to try to block this in Scotland because he's thinking about it a UK-wide issue and it impacts on equality legislation here.
OK.
That's a separate issue, though, and whether the changes in Scotland were significant enough to trigger that.
Well, speaking of separate issues, let's move to the teachers' strike.